Yes, I mean, let's start with the roster. What do you think of the roster?
Um, well, hey, it's great that Zuby Ejiofor is coming back. Um, Great place to start. He has steadily improved as he has been on the team. Um, I think he should be the best player on the team this year, um, especially if he has improved in the offseason. He seems to be a Pitino guy. Um, and I think he's a fan favorite because, and we've talked about this before, not too many people showed up in the NCAA tournament for the St. John's Red Storm, the disappointing loss to John Calipari's team. But Zuby did show up. Zuby came to play. Zuby came to compete. If he had another guy or two that came the same way with the same level of effort, St. John's might have won that game. RJ Lewis obviously had a horrendous last game as a uh, member of the St. John's team. We wish him obviously the best of luck with the Boston Celtics. I'm sure his stats will be uh, computed more in applause than on the court stats with as talented as that team is. But who knows? He may get some burn. He definitely is. He definitely has NBA athleticism. Whether he has the ability to shoot in the NBA, and more importantly, defend in the NBA, will ultimately make him or break him in the NBA. But he is on a good team with a good coach, so he should pick up good habits. He's gone from a legend in Pitino to a young college coach who's much younger than Pitino, but uh, who already has won a championship. um, so he's going to get coached again, and if he's resistant to good coaching, then he's not going to last in the NBA.
Yeah. I'm going to circle back to RJ with you, but I want to go down the current roster and get your opinion on some guys. And I think, the first thing that I just want to, present to you is that the big difference between last year and this year to me, Darrell, is the level of expectation. I think that, again, we watched Pitino last year do something historic with the St. John's organization that was very exciting, not just for the university, but for the entire city of New York. And being in Madison Square Garden with those packed, crowds of 19,000 plus, with a St. John's team that was not overrated, but definitely was exposed in the NCAA for being a very, very team-oriented Rick Pitino team that when they were exposed by Calipari's offense and his guys, they really collapsed because it just takes one player not showing up like RJ did. And all of a sudden, the St. John's organization, that team outside of Zuby kind of fell apart. And now he's put together a totally new roster in which Zuby is the anchor. And we'll see exactly, what Zuby's real makeup is, because again, to your point, not only do we have to see some improvement from Zuby, but this is now going to be a completely mental game for him in terms of being the leader with a bunch of other guys. And the person that is top of mind to me is Bryce Hopkins, coming over from Providence and really being another really, big solid guy like Zuby. The difference between them is 20 pounds and a couple of inches. But, you know, Bryce has the ability to take some of the pressure off of Zuby, he also has the ability to take over.
Absolutely.
And that could compromise Zuby's shine, in, preparing himself for the draft, because that's the other thing you have to think about. So you're going to have some competition there that may be good or it may be a challenge. The other person, again, big three, Dylan Mitchell. Dylan Mitchell, what I think Pitino and my compliments to Pitino are not just his forward thinking with the NIL, but it's also the fact that he refuses to accept anything less than the complete player who's willing to humble themselves in his system. So he went out and he didn't just get long, stretchy guys, but he got guys that were malleable and willing to accept his level of discipline and rigor and commitment to excellence on the court. And that's the other thing I like about these names is that these are guys that they were really good on the teams that they were on, but they were also unselfish. And that's, I think, is going to be one of the things about this St. John's team that we have to see early in the season. The other thing that I think, we really have to think about the difference between last year's team and this year's team was the fact that last year's team took an entire half every single game to figure out how they were going to play their opponent. And they would give up lots of, leads in the first half and come back in the second half and take over the game. I'm curious to see how this team is going to shape the game for themselves. Are they going to be dominant from the beginning? Are they going to lay back and allow the other team to kind of expose themselves and figure out, what works and what doesn't, and then, take over in the second half? What is the character of this team going to be? I'm very curious about that. So, again, in passing it back to you, I think one of the things that, really, really, is the big consideration for this year is just looking at that roster and who are going to be the guys that, we absolutely expect to show up, and then who are going to be the X factors. Is Lefteris going to be an X factor this year?
And I think you mentioned the word character. Uh, and that's what was so disappointing about the NCAA tournament performance is that you didn't expect that to happen to a Pitino team. And again, Zuby,
I was
you know,
very disappointed. Yes.
I don't want to you know criticize the whole team, and but I just don't only and I don't want to only criticize RJ, but Zuby was the only one that showed up. Um, and I don't want to say the stage was too big, but maybe the Big East was overrated. Um, and because of that, or maybe we thought the Big East should have been rated higher, and the Big East was where they were because St. John's dominated the Big East. Um, UConn actually played the best in the tournament, and they lost a close game. Marquette was upset early in the tournament. Um,
No
so
team from the Big East made it past the second round, and I think that says a lot right there.
absolutely. So I think that's what makes the early season schedule. And St. John's had an great early season schedule, pre Big East schedule last season. They do again this season, and that's where Pitino can really judge his team. Because I think playing against the Big East teams, and being able to dominate the Big East turned out to hurt the team going into the NCAA tournament. And whereas after not making the tournament in the 23-24 season. Making the tournament was a big accomplishment last year, but then the team obviously failed miserably. I remember talking to Jim Jackson at one of the games, and he said he thought they were an Elite Eight team at best. But you had people with, notable voices in college basketball seeing St. John's as at least a second weekend team.
Yeah, no,
So,
you remember I told you that I got a chance to talk with Walter Berry, and he thought the team was very special, and he thought they were going to go to the final weekend. He was very excited. And one of the things that we both agreed on was how well Pitino had disciplined this team to the idea of defense and the idea of hustle and the idea of just going after every ball.
mhm,
And in the tournament, to your point, Kadari got into foul trouble. And you could blame the refs, but you could also look at it from the standpoint that his composure all season long was that of the general on the floor. And in that game, you could see the frustration on his face. He was not able to gain composure and reset the team. It was Zuby, to your point. And that's why this year, the weight is on Zuby. There's no question about it that Zuby has to demonstrate his ability to maintain composure, number one, but also recognize the dynamics of being the captain while trying to elevate himself to, the next level. Because that this is a showcase for Zuby this year. That's,
absolutely.
and that I think that's the big thing is that the players that came in this year are looking to showcase themselves under Pitino. And one of the challenges is that a Pitino system isn't necessarily a system that allows you to easily showcase yourself. And circling back to RJ, this is the perfect point that RJ collapsed in the biggest showcase, and yet now he's on the Boston Celtics because the overall talent and discipline that Pitino had a chance to, touch him with and, provide him the understanding. He knew that RJ had next level talent. I remember watching the games last year and talking to several people who were very suspicious of whether RJ would be an NBA player. And I said, look, at his size alone and his overall length and skill, he's very, very coachable to be at the next level from a raw talent perspective. We don't know what happened in that game that he just, completely collapsed mentally, but overall, from a seasonal perspective of what Pitino was able to do with that team and RJ especially, you saw him rise with Kadari in the second half of the season, and really the two of them were the leaders of the team last year. Now, going back to this year, the X factors for me right now, I'm very curious to see Dylan Darling, number one. They've been talking about him all summer long, about this kid's going to be the leader, the floor general of the team, which is ironic because you also have Ian Jackson, who was a Bronx native,
Mhm.
played for our Savior Lutheran School, was a standout, went to UNC. And again, he is a hometown favorite. So we're going to have a big crowd around him as well. And additional to that, I think you have some other players that, Ruben Prey was a big hopeful last year. Now he's going into his sophomore year. Again, 6'11", 230 pounds. From what I heard, he really worked in the offseason and could be quite the factor this year. Oziah Sellers is another one. Again, he's a senior coming in, obviously looking to showcase himself on this team and be a big factor. So the other thing that I think is fascinating about Pitino with this NIL portal, and you're going to see it in the years to come, but I think this year is going to be really exciting from that standpoint and give us a lot of opportunity to debate, is the internal chemistry that he is challenging these guys with because everybody's fighting for a spot on that front five, man. that starting five getting off the bench, you've got at least four players that are not going to be starting, that are going to be sinking their teeth into their first minutes of every game to have a chance to produce and earn Pitino's respect and trust going, through this season. And I think the most important part of this again falls on Pitino and how he manages the team through the season, because he's got these early games against Alabama and Iowa and Michigan. And these are all early tests to see what the mettle of these guys is made of. But man, when it gets into the conference and that conference schedule, you get into game 5, game 6, game 7, Georgetown, DePaul, Villanova, and then UConn. You're talking about this is where the blood and guts of the team is going to be exposed.
And I love how you brought up Kadari. I think another thing that might have hurt St. John's is the physical play of the Big East Conference. Big East Conference is known historically as a physical conference, continues to be a physical conference. That was not a physical game against in the NCAA tournament. And so when you're used to playing a certain style of basketball through the conference and you go to the NCAA tournament and they're calling it differently, that can be a tough adjustment. And obviously was for Kadari because um, a couple of those fouls were questionable and may not have been called uh, during a Big East conference game.
Correct. And I think the other thing, credit to Calipari in how he prepared his guys to take on that St. John's team and play their style, which St. John's was not ready for. I think that was the other thing, was that as much as Pitino had prepared this team all season for battle, having a team that mirrored them in a lot of ways in terms of size and length and talent and overall ability, that game was a terrific game. I don't think anybody can, question the level of talent that was displayed on the floor between both teams. I just think that Calipari understood Patino's, philosophy and dynamic so well that rather than try and go up against it directly with a, different style, he matched that style of intensity with his players and got them to realize that St. John's weakness was really in their own style of play.
Mm-hmm.
And the frustration of Kadari absolutely had an impact on the team. The fact that RJ, just lost, all insight into, just passing the ball. And I think that was the thing that frustrated me. I felt like it was, 1993 or 1994 with Patrick Ewing and the Knicks, and nobody would pass the ball to Patrick in the final game. It was like, why couldn't they get the ball to Zuby?
Right.
There he was, having the game of his life, truthfully, in terms of how he was showing up. And had they got him the ball 4 or 5 more times, it would have been a different game.
Absolutely. And not only and I think this is why Patino took him out the game. Not only was RJ playing selfishly in offense, he was not playing good defense either. So when you're a liability on both ends of the court, you don't deserve to play. And it was sad that he had a stellar St. John's basketball career. That is the reason why he is in the NBA. He had a horrific ending to his college college basketball career. It's unfortunate, but if he can, you know, play a decade in the NBA, that certainly makes up for what he did in college.
I agree, and I think that we talked about this before. It is going to be a fascinating debate amongst the St. John's loyalists as to the contribution of RJ. to the St. John's team versus what he does in the NBA over the next decade if he's able to sustain himself and even, excel. Because, again, his ability to succeed is up to him at this point.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that, is an argument, is that had St. John's made it to the final weekend and RJ had a great tournament, he probably would have been a draft pick rather than, just gotten a walk on and then made it somewhere.
Great, agreed, agreed. Yeah, the NCAA tournament is the biggest stage. When you perform on the biggest stage, your draft stock rises.
Yeah.
When you fall fail miserably on the biggest stage, your draft stock falls. So, as you said, anybody who watched him play, he's got NBA height, he's got NBA athleticism. Um, it's between the ears with him.
Yeah.
Is he going to compete on defense? I can uh, tell you 100% if he does not pass the ball on the Boston Celtics, he is not going to play because there are quite a few players on that team that are better than him, simply
Yeah.
put.
100% agreed. And going back to, this year with the St. John's team, I think that's the other thing that you've got to realize that Pitino knows that he has a core group of guys that are playing for the tournament. They know they have to make it to the tournament to succeed and to make it to the next level, starting with Zuby. And I think that the players who left the team last year also recognized that they had no chance with what Pitino was focused on bringing in, that they were going to, be able to showcase themselves on a St. John's team. And so therefore, Brady Dunlap, who has moved on, and some of the other players, as well. Vince, went to Georgetown. Again, they recognize that Patino's level of, intellectual prowess for building, a powerhouse in the Big East that could make it into the tournament and go deeper had to attract players that were that hungry for it and be determined to go past what this, last year's team did and really, create their own mark on the franchise.
I'm just going back to look at Zuby's numbers from last year. He averaged 14.7, 8.1 rebounds a game. I can definitely see both of those totals going up a bit. Zuby will certainly get the ball more in the post, or at least should get the ball more in the post. And I think Pitino has to be telling him this. You know, he's a forward. He will play center, a lot of center with St. John's, but he is a forward. If he plays at the next level, he's going to be a forward. He's got to show that he can be a dominant force on the boards. So get that 8.1 closer to 10,
Yep.
9 plus, and B, show that he can space the floor because that's what the NBA is all about. So I am sure what Pitino, what his personal team have been working on with him during the offseason is an outside jump shot.
Yeah. The mid range is where it's at for Patino right now. And I think that your point, the difficulty that Zuby is going to have in raising his numbers is that battle with Bryce Hopkins and Sellers for the offensive rebounds. And that's where Zuby really needs to elevate. It's not so much that I think that he needs to have more rebounds in a game, although that number is, very important, but more offensive rebounds. If Zuby starts dominating, the entire league, what he did in the second half of the season last year, he was much more active on the offensive glass. And I think that was one of the things that really made St. John's quite the team going into the playoffs, and really how they won the Big East championship was their offensive rebounding between Zuby and Vince. And funny enough, I think Davon Scott was one of the biggest offensive rebounders besides Zuby, even though he was a guard. But now you've got a big front line with a lot of presence and a lot of ability. And I think that the more that Zuby is able to concentrate, because of Sellers and uh, uh, Hopkins, sorry, because of those two, Zuby may be able to get 210, but have significantly more offensive rebounds, which I think is going to be a big key for him as well as the team. In terms of the scoring, if in my opinion, if Zuby can get 4 points more, so if he's 18 and 10 for the season, he's a lockup, in my opinion, for a draft pick. And that's just, again, my hope for him, but also what I believe that, he should be able to do just based on his leadership on the team, number one, but also what people, have to realize is that Zupi really got good at the follow-up. So a lot of his points were second chance points where he was around the rim. Those offensive boards were also scores. And so if he's able to do that even more, that's going to, allow him to increase his ability to, be that 18-10 player that becomes the dominant force in the Big East, as well as, set the table for the tournament.
Absolutely. And uh, I think being the captain and being someone who's played under Pitino for a couple of seasons, I think Zuby's biggest job off the court will be uh, being a sort of a coach off the court with the newer players to the team, letting them know what Pitino is all about, letting them know the type of effort that Pitino expects from the team.
Yeah.
Um, you know, this goes with all sports. You don't earn your playing time in the game; you earn your playing time in practice.
That's right.
So it doesn't matter who is on the team if they're not performing well in practice, they're not going to get one of those five coveted starting spots that you talked about.
Yep.
And so we may not see why, oh, this guy's so talented. Why is he on the bench? He's on the bench because he's not playing well in practice.
Right.
Um, and Zuby will be the guy to let people know. Zuby's going to bring. I don't know if he's a vocal leader or not, but he's going to display the effort that is needed by his teammates in practice by showing how he comes out in practice.
Agreed. I think that we've said it on this broadcast a couple of times that Zuby is going to set the tone for the team, and the weight is on him. I think the other thing that is going to be very interesting to sort of watch, especially in the first early games of the season, is that resilience that Pitino is all about and how his team, really practices that resilience. Because again, that was the St. John's team last year. The St. John's team last year was an incredibly resilient team that never gave up. And the Villanova loss at towards the second half of the season where they had won 10 straight, and they gave up that game to Villanova, on the final shot, was a perfect, example of the resilience, because that game was so close and either team could have come out and the winner in the end. And I thought that St. John's had every right to hang their hat on that game because they played such an incredible game at Villanova. And, even though they didn't win and it was, the end of their winning streak, it was a top tier game. I mean, that was such a memorable game. And will this team show that resilience early in the season and build off of it and be able to really show teams that to come through Carnesecca Arena or Madison Square Garden, you got to come with your best game because this team is not going to let anybody, come through them easily.
Absolutely. And last year, after Pitino came in, the 23-24 team uh started building the fan base. Obviously, people were disappointed they didn't make the tournament, but there was a lot of excitement going into last season because of Patino. And then the team struggled early, losing those close games uh, during the beginning of the season, and I think that's when the expectations dropped off. Um, and you know I think if the team does win those big games against the bigger name teams like Alabama, if they can win those games, look out. The expectations will go through the roof. I mean, if people were talking about St. John's being Sweet 16, Great 8, Final Four team last year, if they get off to a great start, dominate the Big East this year like they did last year, look out.
That's
You
right.
will have people thinking championship. And I remember one of the um, you know Patino's one of the greatest orators as a head coach in professional basketball history, in my opinion. But when he said these are Knicks crowds that are coming to these St. John's games, he was absolutely right.
Yeah,
It totally transformed um, from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, where you I would talk with some fans. I know, shout out to my boy Dave Russell, um, St. John's alum, who also works in the industry but goes to the games as a Red Storm fan. He would introduce me to some of his fellow alumni, and they were complaining about the ticket prices, and one guy was saying he would sell his ticket and get a cheaper ticket and watch the game from there. He's like, the cheaper tickets are no longer cheaper tickets
that's
on the
right.
secondary market. It's like the prices have exploded. I'll just stay where I am.
That's
You know,
right. Yeah,
uh,
and this year it's even worse. I mean, they sold out the bowl. So, I mean, it's going to be really like a Knicks game in terms of trying to get a seat.
Absolutely. But again, the expectations will come um, with those pre-Big East scheduled games, and hopefully they will do better in those than they did a season ago. Though they were right there, they could have won. They could have easily won a few of those games, but they're playing the Alabamas and the Baylors. They played Baylor last year, lost a close game to Baylor at the beginning of last season, I believe. Um, so if they do well in the pre Big East schedule, then forget it. The expectations will explode through the roof. Um, and that's ultimately what we all hope for.
Yeah,
As New Yorkers, certainly you've had a connection with St. John's. I have never had a connection with St. John's, but as a native New Yorker, you root for New York teams. Um, uh, on our non-journalist side, we always root for New York, whether it's the Jets and or the Giants, the Yankees and or the Mets, the Knicks and or the Nets, Rangers and or the Islanders. You always root for the city's teams, and the same goes for St. John's,
I
um,
agree.
and and to a lesser extent Fordham and some of the other schools uh,
Australia, yeah, yeah, you
that
got it.
are in New York City. But St. John's is where it's at. and that's because of Pitino. Uh, uh, he has done a great job of getting talent to this team, and being the great coach that he is. We expect him to figure out how to make it all work together, um, as the season goes along, dealing with what you deal with as a coach, setbacks, injuries, and things like that. We hope everybody is healthy and ready to play all through the season. But Kadari had lingering health issues all through the season that perhaps Pitino played up a little too much, but they were certainly legitimate injuries that he suffered, and you could tell how much he improved during the season. Was a sign of how much he was hampered early in the season and played through those injuries.
Yeah, agreed. I want to discuss Patino as the final part of this broadcast from the standpoint of number one, you talk about New York teams and what Patino has done with St. John's. A couple of years ago, we would have never even thought that Rick Pitino would be here at St. John's. And again, the level of resilience in that man and how he has embodied it and now put it forth in the program. Now I think that the biggest challenge that Rick Pitino has on his shoulders is the resilience of the fans if this season doesn't go the way that we all expect it to go. Because from my opinion, you think about the recruiting class, he was ranked number 2 overall in the offseason. And right now, depending on who you talk to, St. John's is already in the top 5. I think that every St. John's fan is thinking that they're an automatic number 1 NCAA pick, for the tournament, even though, that's 30 something games away. And, one big injury, God forbid, anything, calamitous happens to any one of the major, players for St. John's, again, they've got a very, very deep lineup, but at the same time, team chemistry is everything. And, this is the other thing you've got to think about as a head coach like Rick Pitino is my season going to be compromised by a major injury that, could throw us completely off track? Because that's, the challenge of a head coach is how do you get these players to play together? And then if an injury happens, are they going to overcome all of, the challenges that they face because of that player being out? And really be able to make that run deep into the tournament in March. And that to me, I think is really going to be what is revealed with this season. The excitement around what he's done with the draft, the excitement around Zuby, the excitement around how these players play, the excitement around the schedule. Because again, Pitino is not shying away from playing some big teams and trying to get as much recognition as possible on the national stage before the tournament, with the full expectation that he wants to, get these guys to repeat in the Big East tournament so they can go into the, tournament with the, premier position and premier stock. So a lot of things have to go right. And the biggest key is your point that he got Nick fans, Nick crowds to fill the garden and make a huge difference in terms of the level of intensity that other teams felt playing in the garden against St. John's. And I don't expect it's going to be any different this year. However, you've got a lot of games early in the day, 12 o'clock starts in Madison Square Garden. Are people willing to come in? I think absolutely, because again, they'll come in, they'll spend the whole day, start with the St. John's game, but you never know. Again, I give him credit for the fact that I think that the early games prevent him from having to compete with a lot of the other events and excitement of the city in the evening. But it forces people to get out of their bed earlier and to come into the city and at midday when the city may not necessarily be the most exciting place. And, these are the cold months of the year, you know, so a lot of things to think about. But I think Patino's biggest challenge this year is going to be that fan base and their resilience if anything goes wrong.
Absolutely. And let's hope that the team is as healthy as possible. Obviously, you can't predict injuries, but given a healthy lineup, we all expect big things from the St. John's Red Storm, um, a dominant uh, regular season again in the Big East, uh, possibly winning the Big East uh, season title and tournament title, and then going in uh, to the NCAA tournament with a top seed.
Final thoughts, Darrell. Who do you think is their biggest challenge in the Big East to challenge them for the crown? And what do you think is going to be the X factor for the team?
I think UConn will probably be the biggest challenger this year. I think Marquette is going to take a bit of a step back. Um, um, Creighton will probably be good, but I think they may take a step back as
Well,
well.
they
So I
lost
think
Kalkbrenner, so that's going to be a
absolutely,
big thing for them.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I think UConn certainly brought in a good recruiting class, and they have a great coach as well as St. John. So I think it will be St. John's and UConn battling for supremacy as it was last year. So I think it'll be a repeat of those two teams battling it out for the top spot in Big East.
sounds great. I'm going to take a slightly different angle. I think that UConn will be the factor, but I don't necessarily think they're going to be the final factor. I do think that it's going to be between Georgetown and Villanova that is going to surprise everybody. And we'll see. But my opinion is that Danny Hurley and UConn is always a factor, but I think that they're going to implode. And yes, I'm saying that now. So I think that St. John's real challenge is going to be between Georgetown and Villanova, how they play, and if they can win those games on the road as well as at home. I think that's going to be the big test for them for this season. And again, going into the tournament, what do you see?
Well, first, I think Coach Cooley at Georgetown would smile if he heard you say that the Georgetown fans have been waiting for a turnaround pretty much since Big John um, left the team as coach. Um, the biggest tournament is because it's consecutive days. There's always the possibility of upsets. Um, I remember this is going back 2 years ago. Even though UConn won the tournament, UConn and Bobby Hurley were mad that they lost to Marquette in the Big East tournament and wanted to come back and win the Big East tournament as they did, and then won a second consecutive NCAA tournament. So the Big East tournament means a lot. Um, but it's such a difficult, as all the tournaments are, would you got to win on consecutive days. Anything can happen. But if the cream rises to the top, I think it will be, and they're both led by great coaches. It'll be UConn and St. John's as the last two standing.
I can't argue with you there. All right.